So here we are, sharing secrets of the soil with me, your host, Regen Ray. Hello, soil lovers. Regen Ray here, and welcome to another episode of Secrets of the Soil. I'm really excited about today's guest because if you haven't been living under a rock, you will know this name. Darren Doherty, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Regen Ray. I'm very envious. I haven't got a sort of a Regen Ray name. That's quite something, mate.
Well, we could play around with the D's, but it would probably
let's not yet. It'll go back to Bewitched or something like that, and it'll bring up childhood trauma.
No worries. Let's move right along. Let's talk about our love for soil. So share with our soil lovers, how you came into this landscape and what Regrarians is all about.
Oh, two big questions there. Probably the second one's the easier one. How Regrarians came about was ostensibly as a rebrand. I came up with the brand, the Regen Ag, in the late noughties, after we had done a successful tour of the US and Europe with the carbon farming. We did carbon farming courses and the carbon economy course, and you might recall around that time that, as I put it, we went from Kevin Rudd to, and then they had their Malcolm Turnbull took over from Brendan Nelson, and then it was just like this whole thing around carbon trading that didn't go down so well. And so when we returned back to Australia from that tour in 2009, I said that carbon was a dirty word, so we rebranded that workshop series, the Regen Ag workshop series. And after a while working with the people, I gave that brand away, and we wanted to come up with something which, Regen Ag had sort of become a vernacular. It was sort of like a public brand as much as anything else. And so for a while I was trying to work out something that was more peculiar to us. So I as you do, come up with a neologism or a portmanteau, and Regrarians, which is regenerative agrarian or rebooting agrarianism, or all of the words that you can think of, and agrarian, because we felt that agrarianism, which is goes back 10 or 12,000 years now, hasn't necessarily resulted in good outcomes for the planet. So we thought, well, it's about time we rebooted that, and so that's where we came up for that. In terms of the soil, I grew up on a small farm outside of Bendigo, and Bendigo, like a lot of goldfields regions, didn't start well from a soils perspective. It's mostly Ordovician sediments, and so 450 million year old seabed, which has been uplifted, and the farm that I grew up on, just before we sold it, I happened to do some soil tests on it, and I was doing a lot of Albrecht-style tests around that time, or had for that previous decade, and it was the worst set of numbers I'd ever seen. Wow. And it's interesting because my grandfather was an early subscriber to J.L. Rodale's Organic Farming magazine. I can remember reading that when I was a kid. He had he hoarded magazines and whatnot, and he had them going back to the 1950s. So they were imported from the United States.
Wow. So
he was into organic farming, and like a lot of people back then, farms were at once a place to feed your children. Sort of there was that subsistence thing, and they had 8 kids, and he was one of 17 himself. So they were that, but then they were also there to provide a product to the market. So our sort of farm fit into that sort of category, and it was highly integrated. We had, my grandmother had a huge compost, which was connected to the pig sheds, which was connected to the sheep and cattle yards and the dairy and the garden. And so there was all of that sort of movement of biomass that I grew up with, which was sort of second. And then we also, straight across the road was what is now the great city of Greater Bendigo National Park. And so we got all of our wood from there, and the wood yard was right next to the compost yard, so a compost pile. So it was all a lot of biomass movement, I suppose. And so that was really the start of our soil journey. But, when it came to the broader landscape, the kitchen gardens and all of the homestead orchards and the soils and that were fantastic. But the broader landscape, our grazing and cropping lands were very, very poor by the time the whole thing ended. And that now I know what I know was largely a function of us not doing what we did in the homestead. We didn't compost. We didn't compost the landscape because you don't compost landscapes, right? Or at that scale, and so on. But it was largely overgrazed and under-rested. It was just a poorly managed country. So that's where we got to.
Yeah, I love that. And what took you to the US to learn this stuff? Because obviously you've seen the landscape unfold and change. And I'm intrigued that you were using the word regenerative, because it seems to me that like this regen word has become overused in the last 5 years. But you're showing evidence of that even back in the noughties, as you referred to them as.
Yeah.
And what took you to US to learn from them?
Well, actually, we did a tour I've always been an avid reader, and in the pre-internet era, the majority of the conversation happened. I'm 55, so I started I'm just about 55, and I started this business in 1993. And prior to that, I was involved in the organics industry in retail and buying. And prior to that, I was working in hospitality as a chef and front of house. Oh. So I've got this, and working in organic. So I've been connected to the organic industry since, I was in my mid to high teens. And back then, the majority of the way that you learned was by magazines. And back then, there was the Organic Growers magazine here, or I think it was Organic Growing magazine. There was Acres Australia. There was a whole host of different material. And then there was the stuff coming from the US. And of course, the Rodales, J.L. Rodale and then his son Bob Rodale and so on, they coined organic agriculture as a term back in the 50s. And then Bob Rodale, following conversations with Alan Savory, came up with the term regenerative organic agriculture, I think in about 1983. So if you, as I had been following all of the literature, as I had from a young age or relatively young age, then these words, this jargon that's become now, was nothing really new. So the words regenerative, sustainable, organic, biodynamic, all of the rest of it were things that were exposed to me quite early. In 2007, which was 13 or 14 years after I started our business, because when we started in 93, we were working mainly in country Victoria and southern New South Wales and in South Australia, so southeastern Australia, as farm planners and developers. So people would come to us and we would design their farm, and then we'd organise the earth movers to build the dams, and we'd go out and do the soil work and plant trees and put in fencing and roads and help them develop their properties. So we did that primarily from 93 till about 2004. Then I moved to Vietnam, and we worked there for Mars Incorporated, helping to introduce cacao as a crop to Vietnam. And then in 2007, we decided to do what we called a soil, water and carbon for every farm world tour, which took us all around the world a few times. We bought 5 round world tickets, and now took our family for 13 months. And introduced what we then called regenerative agricultural concepts to a whole range of different audiences, and then did repeat tours of that thereafter. So that tour was what I called an interview with the planet, because I hadn't gone much out of Australia, and it was to go and see where people were at. And when you do that sort of thing, you tend to meet the early pioneers in markets. So when I went to Spain, I met the early people who were right at the groundswell then, or the US and so on, and South America and wherever, Mexico, wherever we went. So we met the people who were right at the ground of things now. And so it was definitely a case where we learned as much as we provided. You know, people wanted to know about Keyline, and they wanted to know about permaculture, and they want to know those dryland agriculture and those sorts of things that we're probably expert of in Australia. And so we exported that, but then from them we got knowledge about biofertilizers in Mexico and holistic management, and goodness knows whatever else, different ways of agroforestry and whatnot. So it was definitely a learning journey that was a two-way street, if you like.
Yeah, sounds amazing. To me, it feels like it's biodiversity of human knowledge. Sharing such a big pillar in this space is that biodiversity. People think it's plants and bugs and wildlife, but I think the human knowledge and the spirit and our heart and our head is really in that picture as well. And sounds like you got there in a way to exchange from these early innovators and change makers. And I think it's an awesome space to be able to witness that. What was going through your head when you were discovering this back then? Like, were you just so excited to bring it back to Australia, or did you feel? Oh,
no, I was never excited to just bring it back to. It was never, I'm going to bring this back to Australia. It seemed very obvious very quickly that we've got to bring this to the world, because everywhere we went, it was clear what was the dominant orthodoxy of operation. Agriculture is a beast. Orthodox agriculture is a beast of an enterprise, and you don't drive or fly over much that really excites you, right? So it was clear that whatever we had to learn wasn't just going to be of value here in Australia; it was going to be elsewhere, and our family had made a decision to support that. That was a really big part of what we as a family wanted to see happen. We wanted to see a better world and do what we could to enhance that. So, so it was all, and it sort of got us to where we are now, in the sense that these days we've got an online platform called the Regrarians Workplace, and we have about 4,000 members. It's a private professional development platform, and it's really the epitome of where we would have liked to have got to years ago. But you've got to have the digital apparatus. IT is a really important part of the whole story, and it's something that really enabled us to be the knowledge broker, sharer, connector that we've become. Which we were then, but we didn't have the digital apparatus to be able to manage that as well as we do now, with as many people at once as we do now.
Yeah, so, growing a large community, there is a point of like it becomes too much chitter chatter, and mastering that is a skill.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're trying to use something like email, which is what we were doing for a long time, it's just really clunky. I mean, it was designed in 1971 and it feels like it. So whereas Facebook type mighty networks, or the workplace platform as we use, etc., completely intuitive, anyone can use them, and you can have mass communications really quickly with multiple modes as well. So I don't think a lot of people think about that when they're in the roles that people like I am in, but that's something that I was an early adopter as far as internet and internet networking was concerned. So, yeah.
Same. I definitely loved seeing the internet roll out. I was much younger though, but I saw it unroll and starting businesses around it, and getting that same feeling now as we move into decentralization and Web3 and exciting the overlaps between regeneration values and what the future could bring. And so who knows? Yeah, what we'll be all talking on. Maybe it's a metaverse that we all hang out with. I don't know. I love how you've had that ability to zoom out and see how all these dots have connected. why are we now, like, say 20 years on from, you said 2007, we're, 2022, whatever, the 15 years, like, why is it taking so long for people to get it? Because you came back and said this was almost common sense. I've sat here, watched videos going, why is this not everywhere and common? Why do you feel it takes people so long to kind of catch this way of farming a bit more natural?
If you look at the diffusion of innovation, borrowing Everett Rogers' term from his book of the same title in 1963, the diffusion of innovation or innovations takes time. And, P.A. Yeomans, the late, great P.A. Yeomans, in one of his last interviews, he was asked the same question, are you disappointed, more or less, that Keyline hasn't become what it could have been? And he said, well, things don't happen like that, It took a long time for the world to agree with Copernicus, right? And there were factors the handbrake of orthodoxy is always there. And when you understand that, you shouldn't then be surprised. It's disappointing, but you shouldn't be surprised. If we look at no-till, for example, which was that, no-till really started functionally in the mid-70s with the advent of, with the legalisation of glyphosate in its use as a herbicide, and prior to that paraquat. So, but it still took 20 or 30 or 40 years for it to become a practice which even now is only 30 or 40% of cropping markets, or cropping is done using no-till. How long did it take farmers to start growing soya beans in the United States or other places? So sometimes people say, oh, it's market forces. If the market is set up, then people will grow. And there's definitely that. And if you look at soya, well, there was a whole industrial complex that was built around the soya bean, and it took time for that value chain to sort of roll out. But it took less time for that to happen than it did for say no-till or whatever. So what's the incentive right now for someone to become regenerative? It's I would have to say mostly it's a value-based thing. Values-based thing. So, as Charlie Massey, who you've probably talked to about his understanding around transitions and why people transition and whatnot, mostly the push factors are crisis-led.
Yeah, totally.
And then there's another percentage of folks who do it because they've had some sort of values epiphany, but there's some event. There's some push factor that's usually caused the change. It's not because the market's better or this, that, or the other. So I think there's a combination of factors. There's not any one that lead to innovation becoming the norm in whatever field it is. It's been interesting to bear witness to what Ethan Soloviev called the different pathways of regeneration, and which are almost lineage based. So there's the grazing sect who mostly follow the Savory Parsons sort of model of holistic management and planned grazing and what that means. And then so that's just mowed along quite nicely. And that has, and with Terry McCoskey here in Australia, that's actually reached a lot of people and has become like rotational grazing. Most people do some form of rotational or planned grazing now, but that's taken 60 years.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not as big a change for graziers to do that as it is for, say, a cereal producer to go no-till, let alone regenerative organic. Right, the shift to going regenerative organic for crop cultivation and crop production is a much bigger leap and a much bigger change than it is for a grazier to go from set stocking to rotational grazing. So it does depend on what you're operating. So the other lineage is what's happening in the US with, say, the Soil Health Academy and the people who are following people like Ray Archuleta and Gabe Brown and that sort of thing. those sort of folks. That's come along quite nicely, I think. And you've got apparatus which go with that, and really good success which is going along with that. And now push factors such as nitrogen and phosphorus pricing, input pricing, which is pushing things along. And you're supported by high commodity prices. So, and, you know, really good people like Rick Clark and those sorts of practitioner leaders who do all the monitoring and provide all of the financial and production agronomic basis to why you would do this. So yeah, there's a few lineages there. There's certainly no easy answer on it, but it's fascinating to bear witness to.
Yeah, and same for me. And you've covered a lot of ground there in regards to the fact that, yeah, maybe it is a consumer or, you know, signal where people demand better quality food or more nutritional dense food, and maybe there are those crisis points, because a lot of the people I hear from, Gabe Brown, Colin Size, they all had some form of crisis that caused them to think differently and go, well, you know, it's a term I've heard be, you know, you're anti-fragile. You're like, you're at a point where, what have I got to lose? I've kind of at this, you know, bottom place, and I can risk more when you're in that more, what have I got to lose mindset, you know, type of space. But I think there's also a preventative measure that you're right. It is values based, and some people just know that they want to do it differently. It feels right is the word I keep getting. You know, in our Facebook group, when people join, they go, it feels right to do this type of better farming or leave the planet better. And I'm seeing younger people come into farming because they can take the farm over from their parents and regenerate it. It's all of a sudden reignited that flame of something more exciting.
Yeah. And yeah, it's interesting. And I think here in Australia, we don't have we don't have a soil health academy, for example. So when we look at the educational and support pathways that we have here in Australia, as compared with the US in particular, the work that the Soil Health Academy are doing and a few other allied organisations are doing really is there to support that transition. I think too that the Rodale crimper technology and that sort of thing also makes it a bit more straightforward. Here, shifts to more organic cropping systems, well, they're generally still associated with cultivation, which is an anathema to soil health and carbon sequestration. So you're really only left with, I shouldn't say only left with, but you're really left with technologies or management practices such as Bruce Maynard's no-kill cropping, which I'm a big fan of and have been for the whole journey, versus Colin Sice's method, which is giving you 2 bob each way because you can still use the herbicides in that and so on. So you can, it's regenerative in parenthesis, but you're still using the agronomic tools of modernity, which a lot of people aren't too flash about.
And it is very much the right thing at the right time, you know, because it is a transition, it is a process. And I've often seen people who go cold turkey on regen that it just doesn't work. It's kind of like you need the right stepping stone.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. John Kemp's role in the US has been really key as well. And the growth of his operation now, where I think he's got about 50 agronomists on board and has taken investment to expand that operation, is a really good signal for people, particularly because most of his clients are in the cropping game. So, and most of them are going into it because they want to get into organic systems. So, yeah, that's where I find it the most interesting. The grazing side, like I said, is relatively straightforward because ultimately grazing is a natural practice. Crop growing is not a natural practice. So it's really hard to mimic nature. People say they are, but really there's no disc drills in nature, right? You know, they're annual crops. Annual crops by nature exist in ruderal or highly disturbed ecosystems. So, you know, and that's not normal. So it's difficult, therefore, to pull that one off without the agency of machinery and iron and diesel.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's a very valid point as well, because, I heard people say as well, like, if it's going to be really natural, then you shouldn't touch a tractor or you shouldn't touch anything. Just let it wildlifely kind of grow, and what's meant to be is meant to be. But how do you feed so many people in that kind of?
Well, that's a tough one.
and the other word that comes up when I think of that is more syntropic farming. Like, what are your thoughts and takes on
syntropic is I've been exposed to quite a lot of that, particularly in the last decade. And I've become good friends with people like Scott Hall, who's probably Australia's leading practitioner. He's one of our members. And really interested, a few years ago, I was in Spain and Portugal and seeing people apply syntropic agroforestry, as I call it, to those climates. Because that had, as for people who don't know, Ernst Gotch founded syntropic agroforestry in the northern, very tropical parts, wet tropics of Brazil in the Amazonas, and it's now sort of grown out into these other places with whole ranges of different plant assemblies and whatnot. It's a highly innovative space. I think Scott's probably one of the only people who has done it, because he's a market gardener he's a commercial market gardener who's taken on Syntro, as we call it, versus a lot of people who are not coming at it from that background. Yeah. And so it becomes a very, very hands-on, very highly managed novel ecosystem that requires a lot of management and therefore a lot of time, and is not necessarily giving great commercial output. So, but Scott's one person who's been able to pull that off really well. There's others as well I'm aware of elsewhere, but at least in coming into, as it expands into dry areas, it's got a lot of promise, particularly for those on smaller acreages who are looking to also integrate it in and give a greater diversity of production outcome on smaller acreages. I think it'll go quite well. The other thing about it too is that the mixing in of syntropic agroforestry in with market gardening, especially now we've got all these amazing small farm, cordless drill powered market gardens with people like Jody Roebuck, who's a friend and student who, Jody's got a revenue of $250,000 off 2,000 square metres now growing vegetables. It's just extraordinary stuff. I mean, he's a 20-year overnight success story, of course, but it's quite phenomenal what people are able to do as a result of largely the apparatus. Again, sometimes you just need tools, some key tools to come into play to turn keys that where the locks were very, very much locked before.
I think, with the whole syntropic side of things, it's lots of people playing around in that area. And you're right, it needs to be commercially viable, because we're not hunters and gatherers anymore. And sometimes we need to still run machinery down straight lines to pick things or to gather stuff. And so that natural, random, kind of food forest idea that people want, it makes sense from a picturesque Instagram point of view, but commercially viable, it's not a great way. But I think it's important to look at the biodiversity of plants growing together and companion planting and making sure that one plant is fixing what something else is taking and reducing the input and labor that's required by us.
Yeah, no, it's got a lot of upside.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we go more to local community kind of food markets and stuff in the future, but who knows what that is. So lovers, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about the REX program and what the Regrarians is all a little bit about. So stick with us. Wait, before you hit the skip button, if you're a soil lover and love listening to my podcast, then I want you to discover more by getting access to my Patreon, where I share behind the scenes and bonus content that doesn't always make the conversations on the podcast. So head over to secretsofthesoil.com/support, where for a very small fee, you get to hang out with me and other soil lovers, where we get to geek out about soil and get access to exclusive content. It's very exclusive. No, not really. It's just a lot of fun and a way that we get to support this podcast together in order so that we can have deeper conversations all about soil from mentors all around the world. So what are you waiting for? Go on, show your support and token appreciation for this podcast. Until next time, well, I'll let you get back to the show. Cheers. Welcome back, soil lovers. You're listening to Darren Doherty and Regen Ray. We're talking about the Regrarians program. We've been talking about all fun things, but we're about to dig a little bit deeper into Darren's program and the platform that he's kind of created over the years with, I'm sure many people together. You've got lots of different elements. I believe it's 10 elements or principles. What do you refer to them as in this?
Layers.
Layers.
Planners are into layers, Ray. Come on.
Lots of layers too.
Yeah, no, we developed the Regrarians platform, as we called it, in 2010, I think it was.
Yeah.
Or 2009, where we're looking at, we were talking before about that interview with the planet, and fundamentally before then, say before 2007, the primary influences on me as a planner, as a farm planner, were in this order: Keyline, whole farm planning as an outcome of or as a part of the soil conservation lineage, and permaculture design. And two of those were Australian designed systems, and the third, the whole farm planning, came from the US, but the way it was developed here as a methodology was very Australian through the Potter Farm Plan and all the rest of it in the 80s and 90s. So those were the primary influences. And then, because Keyline kind of was a big, like permaculture was really, especially on the meta landscape, was really built off the shoulders of a lot of yeoman's work and so on. So when I went overseas and started to see the big wide world and there was a whole lot of other methodologies that I started to be, had some inkling about, but hadn't sort of seen firsthand. And so I remember I was on a plane one day and I was preparing a presentation, and I did this drawing of all of these methodologies sort of all in a circle, a circle of circles, because you had Elaine Ingham's work, you had Paul Stamet's work, you had holistic management, there were all of these discs, icons, whatever you want to call them, of methodologies. And I was starting to think, well, how do they all layer together? How can they all sync? Because agriculture as a profession is a highly diverse enterprise. So, you've got to be a master of a lot of different enterprises, not just the growing of something. Even if you are just involved in commodity production, you've still got to fix things. You've still got to do a lot of things that a lot of people, your city counterparts, don't have to do as many things in their daily lives. So it's very diverse. And the other part that happened, the late Bruce Ward, who was probably the leading holistic management trainer here in Australia, he invited me to come and teach. He and a range of other Australian holistic management certified educators land planning, because he saw that the holistic management land planning framework wasn't the strongest part of that suite. So they asked me to come and do that, and I talked to Ian Chapman about that. And Ian was a holistic management trainer as well, and practitioner and farmer, and a keyliner, as it were. And we got talking about it. And I said, "So how do you do your training?" Because he still works with TAFE. And he said, "I use the Keyline scale of permanence." And I went, swear, jar. I think, bloody hell, I've been doing Keyline all my life. I've taught about the Keyline scale of permanence, and I'd never considered it for being this pedagogic framework. And I always considered, when in my study of methodologies, I saw that like Keyline had only gone so far because Yeomans never developed a pedagogy. Permaculture went around all around the world because Mollison had the sense and genius to develop a really strong pedagogy, the permaculture design course, which was built around a book. So he built the whole package. And because he built that strong package, hundreds, if not millions of people around the world have done the same permaculture design course, right? And that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Whereas Yeomans didn't develop anything similar. Alan Savory developed courses with holistic management, which, so it became clear to me that when you develop a pedagogy aligned with a methodology or a framework, well, then that makes it so much more powerful. But you've got to have something to hang that off. And so that conversation and then that course that I taught, that conversation with Ian and then that course with those holistic management professionals was a really strong first test. It was quite intimidating because a lot of those people were a lot older than me, a lot more experienced, at least in livestock grazing systems and whatnot. But we had a really great time over those 5 days. And that was the foundation for me then to then go, oh, right, Yeomans 8, the Keyline scale of the relative permanence of things agricultural, which is how Yeomans put it, or the Keyline scale of relative permanence. It wasn't what I would call holistic. He called them 8 factors: climate, land shape, farm dams, farm roads, farm buildings, subdivision fencing, and soil. Soil was at the bottom, number 8, because it was the fastest to be destroyed and the fastest to be put back into life. The climate, on the other hand, you can't change, right? You get what you get. So all of these things, once I settled on that, I started to go, oh, right, what's missing here? There was no bit about economy and there was no bit about energy. So those I tacked on because you can change your economy these days very quickly by going online and selling everything that you own, right? Or you can put yourself online and start to interact with an audience, whereas before it was a lot, you had to, when you only had print media to deal with, took weeks and months to get the sort of response. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And energy, as I put it, there's nothing as fast as a photon of light. And that's where it all starts because photosynthesis drives everything. So I started to frame that and I thought, oh, what about climate? Climate, what's the hardest thing to change? And I came up with the term that the climate of the mind is the hardest thing to change, which goes to our discussion before around transitions with people. Why aren't people doing more of this? Why does innovation take so long to become normal practice? So there was all of that. And then the reframing of things, landscape to geography, farm dams to the water layer, farm roads to access. Words are powerful, and just changing that framework and bringing it out to 10 layers then provided us with this base that I couldn't have come up with when I was in 93, when I was just starting out. I probably could have if I was a genius, but it took a long time. And once we developed that, it was like, oh, right, now you've got something to hang off and a base to a pedagogy, which we'd always been frittering around with, doing permaculture or doing our version of what a Keyline pedagogy might look like and so on. And we felt that we had something that was a heck of a lot more holistic and a lot more attractive, and that's proved to be the way. And the other thing that happened too is with that going into training is that it meant you had an A to Z. A lot of people have said to me over the journey with, permaculture courses or looking at Keyline or whole farm planning, there's no, like people say, oh, you shouldn't be linear in the way that you plan, but people are often linear. I mean, we like to work that way, like to work, you do this and then you do this and you do this, right? So us going, all right, well, the first thing we're going to do, and this is how our courses work, is we're going to understand our climate, right? And what is our climate? Our climate of regulation we've got to establish what our climate of regulation is. We've got to establish the climate of the meteorological climate, the political climate, the economic climate, all of the different words that we associate with climate are not just meteorological. Yeah. And the climate of us and our enterprise and our family, what do we want, all of those sorts of things. So that's the headline act. So we get that out of the way so we understand what the rules of the game are, because that's where you've got to start. And then what's the rules of the terrain, the geography, where we are. If we're out west of Dubbo, well, then that's very different to us being in around Sydney, Campbellfield or wherever, or Camden. Those sorts of places or the Hawkesbury River. It's very different where you are, and so on. Proximity to populations, markets, and on it goes. And then what how capable your land is to do different things, and so on. So establishing that, and then the water layer, and then you get into what we call our infrastructure layers, where we're looking at the water layer. What are you going to do there with pipelines, dams, reticulation, all of that sort of thing, access, roads, tracks, trails, the ecosystems layer. So we went from farm trees to ecosystems. So what's that living layer look like? What sort of biodiversity and so on are we looking to engage with? The buildings layer, the fencing layer, the soils layer, the economy layer, and the energy layer. So pulling that all together and at least asking the question. So we go through a checklist and just see where we're at right now as a starting point, and which is how planning works. Landscape architecture, for example, as a methodology, you always go through and you look at what you have right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you look at the proposed treatments, as they call it. And I think treatments is a good term, because a lot of what we've got to do is treatment. And you've got to do a diagnosis of where you're at, and then the plan, and then work to use management for the treatment. And so that's what we do with our program. So the REX program is now online. People do that for a year. We do 2 14-week programs where we go through those layers, but we give people about 4 or 5 months in between. So they do their first REX, which just focuses on where they're at right now. And then we have conversations, sort of downtime and conversation in between. And then we come back, and for the second REX, they might focus on the water layer or this, that, and the other. So they'll have because priorities change, and planning should always be well supported and longitudinal. And that was something that we couldn't do before because we didn't have the digital IT apparatus to wrap around that. So it's a good time to be able to do that sort of thing. And I think that's partly why online courses work so well for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you leave no stone unturned in something like this. I love that. Speaking of all these layers, it reminds me of a lasagna. It's every part.
Yeah, it is.
But then it's because it's lunchtime and I'm hungry. But it's it's important that they all kind of stack in a certain order, and you can go back and revisit some, and so it takes 12 months. Do you have students start at their own time, or does everyone go through the program all together?
Generally all together. So we're week 7 into our 9th online REX program at the moment. So we start our 10th in November. So we'll have a couple of months, we'll do November, December, have a break for Christmas, and then come back in January. So we'll do that. It generally works that we get a lot of new membership coming in, say a month or 2 prior to the start of each REX. That's been historical since we started doing these in 2017. So we've got this really strong communication period where everyone's doing their work and conversing, and we look at it as sort of like a barn raising, that concept from the US and Canada, where the community comes together to help raise a barn. Well, this is your community of peers from, in our case, from 85 countries or so. And different languages, because again, the IT is fantastic now. People can have multilingual conversations, which is awesome.
Crazy.
So a grazier in Somaliland who speaks French can speak with someone in Turkey, can speak with someone in Brazil, or Russia, and all at once. But having that ability is really cool. So we get that together, and then people carry those conversations through, and then have the period in between where there's reflection, because it's an intense planning can be, and courses. You're paying money and you sort of owe it to yourself and your investment to put in. But then you need a bit of downtime and a bit of reflection time. And, obviously too, you've got to still go out and cut hay and run the place. So there's that as well. Yeah.
Rest. The rest is more important.
Well, and a bit of rest, yeah, as well.
I love that. And so do you need to have land in order to do these type of programs?
About 10%, and that's been a constant of our, we generally have around 200, 250 people do each Rex. That's been a constant as well. About 10% of them are consultants, agronomists, advisors, but there's also a smaller cadre of that, or percentage of that, are people who are looking to buy land. So they're new to agriculture, or they're between. We've got some people who are between farms, like one guy who grew up on a farm, gone to the city, wants to get back into it. So there's a few people like that who just want to come in and sort of use our kind of, like you say, quite comprehensive platform and layers of consideration, so that they can come at it again with a bit more of an integrated approach that's actually built around a platform.
Yeah, well, that's what would like to be more wiser when looking for land and go, well, now I know I'm looking for this, this, and this, or
absolutely.
That's how I solve it. So
yeah, well, look, a lot of people put a lot more effort into designing their house than they do their farm. Which is I think somewhat reflected in some of the outcomes that are out there.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Darren, are you ready to become the voice of our soils?
I do a voice. Yes, just one of the many microorganisms that are a part of the whole blancmange, to lead to, which is always an essential ingredient in any lasagna.
It's true.
Sorry, blancmange, bechamel, I should say.
I knew exactly what you're
I don't know where I got blancmange from, but anyway.
Well, let's do this. So, Darren, you are now the soil. You have embodied its powers and it has a voice. So what would you say to the people on the planet as the soil?
I would say care for me. I would say consider me. I would say that topsoil regeneration should be the number one outcome of the existence of every human.
Period. Love that. Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Thank you for being the voice of the soil today, Darren.
Pleasure. Thanks for the time.
How can people hang out with you more? I know you've shared a lot of wisdom and gold nuggets and everything, and I can't wait to get my hands a little bit dirty with the Rex program myself. So how do people hang out with you and the Rex program more?
Well, they go to the Regrarians.org website and click on the panels that are there, and you can see there's a variety of different pathways. One is which, like you say, to do the Rex program, which involves becoming a member, a planner member, which has a fee. But there's also a number of resources which are themselves free, and some paid resources. But, we fundamentally try and work directly with people, and that's why we developed a membership-based organisation, which enables us to be very efficient in the way that we are able to work with so many people all at once with such a small team. So so you got to pay up.
Yeah, good. And work smarter, not harder.
No.
But
we do provide an enormous amount of value with our packages, but anyway, people can have a look at that at the Regrarians website.
Yeah, and you'll find someone who's done it. Like that's how I, I've met many people in my journey, and they just always say this is like where they want to hang out, and I love it. And so definitely feel like that's talking from experience more than knowledge is. And how many people in your workspace now? Is it like?
We're about 4,000. We just kissed the ground. The organisation they just joined us, so we're doing that as well now. Because our workplace is so well developed, we've got a Regrarians collaborative program going where we're hosting other organisations. So 3LM, who are the Savoury Institute hub in the UK and Europe, they run their whole operation within our workplace, and a number of others. We've got some across Europe and South America and Mexico, and now Kiss the Ground as well have come and joined us. So we've got we're about 4,000 or so. Yeah, which is not huge. I mean, there's a lot of Facebook groups out there which have got tremendous numbers now, but I suppose. We don't have any moderation, no moderation required, because we've done the whole Facebook thing, and we know that for whatever reason drives a different culture of use, and people just get down to business, and that's why we call it a professional development network. So because that's what we're there for, that's our purpose. We try to drive that people are purpose driven, and that's really important.
Yep. Good old saying, quality, not quantity, So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And that's what I hear all the time is that, things get solved and collaborated, and so many people in the network giving and sharing and what a, kudos to you for building such a great community and platform and building on these frameworks and renaming things. You're quite right. The lexicon that we use is so powerful because, some people can just dismiss something because it's the wrong word. But then when you change it, it's like, oh, hits the heartstrings a little bit differently,
Yeah. You got to have the resonation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Darren, until next time, thank you very much for hanging out with myself and all our soil lovers. And
no worries.
To popping in and having a coffee at the cafe one day.
That sounds good, mate. Well, that's been an honour, and I appreciate all the work that you and Helen and Hugh have done over the years as well. It's quite something.
Yeah, excellent. Well, there you go, soil lovers. Until next time, get outside, get your hands dirty, and keep digging deeper into our wonderful world of soils. Stay curious. Hello, soil lovers. I hope you're enjoying today's guest and this podcast, but I wanted to just let you know that when you get excited about soil, just as you're hearing about our guests, then you will want to check out the Soil Learning Centre. The Soil Learning Centre is a hub that we put together and digitalized all the content over the years that were originally on DVD into this online learning experience. So if any of our guests or any of the topics that we speak about during the podcast whet your appetite and you want to get your hands dirtier and dig deeper and get educated around different things around soil, whether it be biodynamics, permaculture, whether it be using a microscope, or whether it just be hanging out with other like-minded educators, mentors and facilitators, then the Soil Learning Centre is a place for you to hang out and dig deeper. That's the soillearningscentre.com. We have lots of different programs, courses, and even a membership. So if you want to belong to a community of other soil lovers, then that's the place to hang out. Well, soil lovers, that's enough secrets for one episode. I really hope that you enjoyed all the secrets shared during this conversation. But hey, let's not keep it a secret. Please share this podcast around and make sure that you like it and leave us a review, because that really helps spread the secrets of the soil. Until next time, remember, get outside, get your hands dirty, and keep digging deeper into your soils.